Welcome to the Meristem Minute. This morning, we have Eric Winans from the BRANDT Research Farm visiting with us. He is the research farm manager as well as the technical agronomist. He is going to help us understand and focus on late season plant nutrition needs. So Eric, take it away and help us really realize what the key components are that plant needs in the last part of those growing conditions.
Yeah, thanks, Melanie. We did a Meristem Minute last year on a very similar topic. We're talking about parent nutrition with our fungicide pass, and we've definitely seen here at the research farm and a lot of our third-party testing that's one of the most responsive, or I guess in terms of an ROI and yield, management practice a farmer can do. If we're making that trip with our crop protection products, pairing the key nutritionals that crop's needing late season to really add to that grain weight has been really responsive for us. And last year we really focused on corn. What are some elements that are really responsive with that fungicide pass? And if we think about corn and that fungicide application, what we're really after is extending that photosynthetic capacity of that crop later into that season. And when we're looking at pairing nutrition with that, usually it's things like boron, potassium, some of these elements that are going to assist that plant in moving those sugars that we're creating through this photosynthesis from that fungicide application, moving those sugars into the developing kernels. And we covered that really well. And I wanted to spend more time today talking about soybean, because soybean, when we think about its yield components, are a little bit more nuanced than corn is. Unlike corn, soybean goes through an indeterminate growth phase, meaning it goes through vegetative growth and reproductive growth at the same time. Whereas corn, it'll go through all of its vegetative growth, then it puts out its tassel and starts its reproductive growth and kernel fill. But soybean, it'll go through vegetative growth. And when we're looking at high yield management practices, we're all about planting early, providing the proper nutrition, trying to get that crop to flower as early as we can in that season. And by doing that, we're extending that R1, R2, R3 growth stage while we're still putting on new nodes or points of attachment for pods at the top of that plant. So when we're thinking about a late season application or typically a fungicide application in soybean, we typically target that R3 application timing. And really the reason why we're doing that is because of that R3 timing. That's when we have the majority of those trifoliates in the middle of the canopy exposed for application of that fungicide. And we remember a given trifoliate attached to a specific node is going to be the primary source of energy for the nodes or the pods developed at that node. And so that's really why we target that R3 growth window. So when we go in at an R3 timing with a fungicide application and nutritionals, not only do we have the ability to impact seed fill, but we're actually still impacting flower development, pod development, vegetative growth, and then the start of that seed filling. Because of that indeterminate growth, we're overlapping a lot of these growth processes in soybean. And typically when we're making that R3 application, guys are thinking, oh, that's my late season application. Well, actually, when we look at when that soybean crop picks up dry matter and develops, R3 is about the middle of the growing season. We're at about 50% dry matter accumulation at that R3 window. We still have about half the season left in terms of nutrition to take up and dry matter to accumulate beyond that R3 growth stage. And when we're thinking about high yield, it's typically all about node number, pod number, driving as many pods on that plant as we can, but we can't ignore the ability to impact seed weight. And that's one thing that Alex Harrell really demonstrated with his record soybean yield of 206 bushels this past year with that season-long fertility management. A typical soybean seed, an individual soybean seed weighs about 150 milligrams. It's a very light weight, 150 milligrams. Alex's average soybean seed weights were 274 milligrams, almost double what a typical soybean seed weight is. So that should show you what the ability is, for proper nutrition to really impact yield through adding seed weight at the end of the season. But we have to remember that these yield components compensate with one another. If we really drive pod number and seed number with the same number of resources to fill those pods and seeds, well, then we end up with a lower seed weight on average. Or if we are capped on our pod number, seed number with all these resources to fill those seeds, we end up with heavier seeds, heavier weights on those seeds. And so we need to think about what are some elements that are going to impact both pod number and seed weight, especially at that R3 timing when that crop is determining yield through those multiple components. And boron is one of those elements. We know boron is really important for reproductive growth. When we think about in corn, that high demand for boron occurs directly ahead of tassel when that crop begins reproductive growth. But uptake of boron is season long for soybean, and there's actually very limited remobilization of boron in soybean. So we're not moving that boron out of the leaves and petioles or the stems into those pods. It has to take it up season long. And so we need to manage boron season long. But, soybean as a plant, in terms of its reproductive capacity, it has the ability to set way more pods and flowers than it'll actually end up filling. A soybean plant will abort anywhere from 50 to 75% of its flowers in young pods. And having boron in check, at a high level in the plant tissue will help us retain a lot of those flowers and pods. And so as we get into that R3 growth stage, when we're still, putting on new blooms, we're beginning pod development and beginning that the filling of those pods, that's where boron's in highest demand, right around that R3 growth stage. And late season too, beyond that R4 stage, boron's one of those elements that has the highest demand as we get into that seed fill stage. About 60% of boron will be taken up beyond the R4 growth stage. So there's a lot of boron to be taken up late season. But when we're managing boron, whether it's at first bloom or that R3 growth stage, we're seeing increased branching and flowering, a decrease in the abortion of those blooms, which in turn increases our pod set. And then we also see better seed development and grain yield on the back end when we're filling those pods.
So Eric, one thing that I've experienced with boron is on both corn and beans, the need becomes so high going into those reproductive stages that even if you've loaded your soil, your root system can't take up enough. And so there really needs to be other supplemental measures taken to make sure that that plant has the right amount.
Absolutely. And that's really what we're after with foliar nutrition. We're trying to address transient deficiencies, which is another word for temporary deficiencies. If we get into a hot and dry stretch, even if that soil fertility level is high, we can't pull that nutrition in quick enough through the roots to keep up with crop demand. And so that's when we're able to go in with a foliar application of nutrition at key elements at specific timings to address that temporary deficiency and kind of bridge the gap and keep things moving in that plant. And so that's really what we're after when we're making that foliar boron application.
And with that right absorption product, that right product that really does get in the plant, it does not take a lot. I think that's the misconception about some of these nutrients is how is foliar feeding enough? And so it's really just that minute amount that you need, but you do truly need to get into the plant. And that's where there's a little bit difference in the products out in the marketplace.
Yeah, that's where the right source really comes into play. There's a lot of options for foliar fertilizers, but when we think about EDTAs or chelates, those are large molecules. They're protected. They're very stable in soil application. They're not great for foliar application because it's all about getting past that leaf cuticle and being mobile in the phloem and moving to that growing point. And there's developing pods. And boron is one of those elements that's one of the least efficient elements to actually apply foliarly because a lot of it likes to get caught up in the pectins and in the cell walls of the leaf tissue. And because that's boron's job. About 90% of the boron in the plant is found in cell walls. It's really important for cell wall structure and stability. So if we're going out with a 10% boron, yeah, we can spike the tissue test, but a lot of that boron's stuck right there on that leaf. It's not moving through the plant. And so our proprietary cross-linked boron, it's already it's mimicking that natural cross-link, but in solution, we see much better movement of that boron beyond the point of application to that growing point. And we have that proprietary boron in HOMESTRETCH NKB-S. And so the boron that we're applying there really is the good source of boron, and we can get away with a quart to 2 quarts of application opposed to a gallon or 2 gallons of 10% boron and see similar, if not better, responses to that application. And with that boron and NKB-S, we're also addressing several other elements that are really key at this timing. And as we go through these, you'll notice that a lot of them have to do with maximizing photosynthesis and sugar movement to those developing pods, as well as maximizing the utilization of nitrogen. Another thing that we kind of underestimate in soybean because they fix a lot of their own nitrogen, is that, that soybean crop actually has a higher demand on a per bushel basis than corn does. And we're relying on our nodules to fix about half of our total nitrogen, but nodulation begins to slow beyond that R5 growth stage, but there's still a huge demand for nitrogen beyond that. And so we like to focus a lot of these other elements, especially micronutrients that will assist the utilization of the nitrogen that's already there into making yield. And so in Homestretch NKB-S, we have molybdenum. Molybdenum is really important for soybean and maximizing nodulation. There's a nitrogenase enzyme that basically fixes atmospheric nitrogen into ammoniacal nitrogen that the crop can use. And that enzyme needs moly to carry out that function. So we can see increased nodulation and nitrogen utilization from a foliar moly application. Boron, we already talked about how important it is for both reproductive growth and as well as cell wall structure. When we have good cell wall structure, especially through the phloem, we see better sugar translocation in the plant. So again, if we're trying to increase photosynthesis with a fungicide application and we're using boron to increase our cell wall structure, we see better movement of those sugars from those trifoliates into those developing pods. Boron also is really important for nodulation and nitrogen assimilation in the plant. Potassium, which we have paired with that boron and NKB-S, is also really important for sugar movement as well as water use and drought tolerance. So we think about right now, it's kind of a double-edged sword. We need potassium to get through these dry spells, but if we're dry, we can't pull potassium in through the roots from the soil. And so a foliar application can help bridge that gap. And we've been really responsive to that potassium application foliarly because it's really important for sugar movement and nitrogen movement in the plant as well. I like to explain potassium is the elevator in the plant. It's helping bring nitrogen up the plant and helping moving sugars down the plant. And then lastly, sulfur. Sulfur is really important for protein development. There's certain amino acids and proteins that require sulfur. So if we have nitrogen there, sometimes that nitrogen can't be assimilated into amino acids, proteins, enzymes if we don't have elements like sulfur, zinc, moly, some of these elements that are really important for converting that nitrogen into usable form. And then sulfur is also really important for chloroplast development as well as maximizing photosynthesis at this stage.
One key thing you bring up is really the components and how these components pair. And I think it's really important, and it's not talked about often enough, is there are key pairs in nutritional pieces. And so, when we talk early on, phosphorus and zinc really need each other to work and function properly. Boron and potassium are somewhat of that same pair up and structure, that they need each other to function properly in that plant. And so having the right components in one mix is really meaningful to get the most benefit out of it.
Absolutely. And that's what, when we're making a package of nutrition like this, we're trying to address a common issue. With late season, it's all about moving sugars to those developing pods, and as well as maximizing the utilization of nitrogen that we already have there to assist that crop in developing proteins and filling those pods. And so all these elements, the potassium, the boron, the sulfur, and the molybdenum are all aimed at assisting that plant and filling those seeds and those developing pods.
So Eric, you talked a bit about how R3 is the perfect timing and the reason we do fungicide and I'm a firm believer R3 is the economic win point for fungicide. And so there's where we pair that NKB-S. But you also talked about that really creating larger beans and finding that balance of not only do we want more beans, but then driving them late season and thinking about late season. So R3 is our standard recommendation, that R2, R3 fungicide timing. But if you were really someone that was going to push yield, is there another application?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, these yield components compensate. So if you know that you've driven a high pod number, you're going to be that much more responsive to a later application than R3. Going out of R5, R5 is a timing where we like to layer another residual fungicide to extend that photosynthetic capacity. We're also pairing an insecticide at that time, trying to address those insects that are feeding directly on the pods and seeds themselves. That will help. That will drastically decrease pod weight and lead to all kinds of issues. Like green stem syndrome. But nutrition at that timing as well is going to be really important. If we're making that pass, that late season pass, nutrition is one of those elements that we can directly impact pod fill and seed weight.
Excellent. You brought up insecticide, and I'll hit on one last thing is when working with your team, one thing I've really learned about is the pH balance of your water and how the NKB-S can really influence the pH of your application and therefore better enhance your fungicide and your insecticide performance.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. We're getting better kills with these insecticides when we're dropping that pH to, below a 6, closer to 5. And all these home stretch products are really designed to help buffer that pH down to, about a 5 pH. So we get better activity or efficacy out of a lot of these crop protection products that we're utilizing.
Well, excellent, Eric. I appreciate your time. This is great information, especially on, a time right now when the soybean seems to be the place to spend your money and where we can better influence that yield to make a better economic return. So appreciate your time and information. So thank you, sir.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.